the subtitle makes reference to Lost Mission of Jesus. Really, the book is focused on how the whole story of the Watchers, as told in the Book of Enoch or other Enochian material like the Book of the Giants from Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, how that material bleeds into the New Testament. In other words, where is the evidence that the New Testament writers had read this material, and how does that affect what they produce under inspiration in this thing we call the New Testament? And when you begin to detect that and see it, it sort of, there's a thematic relationship between New Testament passages that reference something to do with the transgression of the Watchers, i.e., the events of Genesis 6, and the Messiah in Jewish thinking. I like to introduce the whole idea this way because it is unfamiliar to a lot of people. They either debate about Enoch or they don't want to hear about Enoch, or Enoch's just this horrible thing or whatnot. And it's a book that the New Testament writers were very familiar with, and Jews in general, and it formed part of their messianic profile that they had in their heads. If you asked the average Christian today, hey, why is the world so bad? Why is the world the mess that it is? Why do we have depravity? What explains what we see in the world around us in terms of the way humans are evil? The average Christian would say, well, that's the fall. Okay, Genesis 3. And again, it's not a wrong answer. It's not a bad answer, but it's the answer that we're taught. If you ask the same question to a first century Jew, a Jew living in the Second Temple period on into the first century, hey, why is the world so messed up? They would say the fall, Genesis 6, or what happened at Genesis 6 before the flood with the Watchers, and what happened at the Tower of Babel. They would have three answers for you. They wouldn't just give you the default, oh, that's the fall, sort of answer, which is what we're raised with, again, as Christians. The Second Temple Jewish answer would be that plus other things. So it'd be quite different. And they had a sense that human depravity, again, the evil condition of the earth, was at least in part due to the sin of the Watchers, really the sins of the Watchers, both the transgression, with women in Genesis 6, and even more importantly, the idea that the Watchers were the ones that taught humanity how to use certain technologies to basically ruin themselves, self-destructive behavior of all types. And so, since that was part of the human condition, the Messiah was viewed very, I think, understandably, as the person who would come not only to reverse the effects of Eden, in other words, provide a solution for man's estrangement from God, and the problem of death. Okay, he's certainly going to answer those things. But the Messiah was also here not just to reverse Eden, the fall of Eden, but to reverse the terrible self-destructive behavior of people that Jews laid at the feet of the Watchers, and also, of course, to reverse the situation from the Tower of Babel. That is, to bring the Gentiles back in, to release them from the dominion of the fallen gods that were over them, and to bring them back into the fold. So the Messiah was the person to enact all three of those reversals. But we are really only taught, typically in church, one of them. Unseen realm, I get into the third thing a lot with cosmic geography and the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. But in this book, I wanted to focus specifically on the transgression of the Watchers, how the Messiah was viewed as the ultimate solution to that.
Self-destructive behaviors. What kind of behaviors would they have been thinking about?
The Watchers get blamed for humanity learning, warfare, learning, metallurgy, and then they made weapons and killed each other. Things like, makeup for women, it gets condemned. Why? Because there's something inherently wrong with that? No, because that was part in the ancient mindset of the art of seduction, illicit relationships, adultery, all that sort of thing. So there are certain, if we want to call them technologies or really sort of language areas, areas of knowledge that the Watchers are blamed for instructing humans in a negative, again, self-destructive way. Basically, hey, here's how you can really, ruin yourselves. Here's how you can really corrupt your lives. Here's how you can really be miserable and make other people miserable. We'll show you just how to do this. So obviously not marketing it that way.
Right.
But that, again, in the Second Temple Jewish mindset, all of that stuff is laid at the feet of the watchers. And so they expected the Messiah to deal with all that.
Mm. One of the things I found interesting is I've been researching the book that Defender Publishing is putting out at the same time as yours, The Great Inception, is looking at some of the gods of ancient Babylon and the Sumerian period that preceded it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm by no means an expert, but one of the things that comes pretty clear is that the goddess Inanna, who has been known by many names throughout history, Ishtar, Aphrodite, Astarte, Venus, was responsible for an awful lot of these behaviors that you just named. She was gender fluid. There are some texts that suggest that in a certain situation she was male. Certainly her followers reversed gender roles.
Mm-hmm.
Men dressed like women dressed like men. Sometimes they dress like, half one side, half the other.
Mm-hmm.
There's some question about how much of this was enacted in the temple itself.
Mm-hmm.
But is this, how much of this kind of behavior was top of mind for Jews of later eras? Now, considering that the amount of time that passed between Jesus and us is roughly the same amount of time that passed between the days of ancient Babylon
mm-hmm.
and Jesus,
mm-hmm.
about 2,000 years or more. How much of that would have been top of mind to Second Temple Jews when they were thinking about the role of the Messiah?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any sort of illicit sexual behavior would have been ultimately parsed as some kind of mimicry or miming, of the incident with Genesis 6. Again, that might sound strange to our ear because, again, we're not used to having our heads in this sort of material. But
mm-hmm.
since biblically speaking, there's a lot. There are connections. Let's just Og of Bashan.
Mm-hmm.
This was one example that you think wouldn't relate to this, but actually does. We get the description of Og's bed. We never get the description of how big Og was, but we get the bed, and that those dimensions match precisely the ritual, lovemaking bed at Enemanki. I always
mm-hmm.
mess that up, that long Mesopotamian word. But the ziggurat there that again takes us right back to this, this Babylonian context of essentially, transgressing heaven and earth, mixing these things that shouldn't be mixed.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's important because you have the whole, the word behind, as we were discussing, on the show earlier, you get this talk about the Amorites and the Rephaim.
Mm-hmm.
And the Martu, is going to be a Mesopotamian term that links right back into Babylon.
Right.
And that's the context for the Apkallu, which is the original Mesopotamian context for Genesis 6.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have literate readers that, again, can sort of understand why certain things are placed in stories, why certain vocabulary words are used, they are used to provide footholds, little toeholds, links back into this kind of material. And in the case of sacred prostitution, there's invariably going to be, this element. It's bigger, than just, events at Genesis 6, but it includes this is sort of a common denominator kind of thing that runs through it. In academia, you can get, I don't know if you have this book, but there's a whole book on sacred marriage edited by Nisanen, where he goes from Sumer all the way into post-New Testament eras, tracing themes of quote-unquote sacred marriage, that is, the gods either cohabiting with each other or the gods and humans, either men or women, cohabiting with each other, either literally in their thought or ritually to, have the gods do something for them
mm-hmm.
or to, get some sort of, divine response. So as bizarre as it sounds to us, this was a big part of their world. And so when Jews and Christians are looking at this, again, if they're literate readers, if they understand the ancient context for a lot of this, and books like Enoch preserve a lot of it,
mm-hmm.
preserve very specific elements that go all the way back to Mesopotamia. If they have that in their heads, there are certain things that are going to stand out, and they're going to take their minds back to those themes.
Mm. And when do scholars think the Pentateuch was written. I know that there probably aren't many who say that Moses literally wrote this down in the 15th century BC. You know, when they were wandering around between 1446 and 1406 BC, Moses actually took time out to write this, or shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I would I would say that the dominant theme, you know, when it comes to the Pentateuch, you have the standard documentarian view, JEDP.
Mm-hmm.
And the dates for those alleged sources ranges anywhere from, 1000 BC all the way into the exile.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why 1000 BC scholars feel sort of safe with that is because we have epigraphic Hebrew, in other words, written Hebrew outside the Bible that we can prove, existed at around that time. People are very free to say, well, they probably writing before that, but here's the inscriptions we have, so we feel safe with this, date as far as the beginning. But they don't assign Mosaic authorship to any of this. Genesis 1 to 11, again, and you'll have evangelicals, who take this position. I think there's something to it. In those first 11 chapters, are very Babylonish in context. Most of what's in there has some specific attachment either to Babylonian religion or even, Babylonian text that the biblical writer is, in some cases you could say has in front of him and is responding to for theological reasons. And that's something that probably goes best during the exile when they're in Babylon. You could speculate a bit about how it could have happened earlier. But that doesn't mean that nothing had been written in those 11 chapters prior to that. But there's certainly, at the very least, I would say, editorial work. And that these kind of thoughts are unfamiliar to most in the church because of the phrase "the law of Moses," in the Bible. And in Hebrew, it's just a simple construct phrase. It can mean the law that originated with Moses. It can mean the law that's about Moses. He's the main character. The law, with respect to Moses, that law, not some other law, this one, that's associated with the Mosaic period. It doesn't have to mean that Moses wrote every word of this. I don't accept the documentarian view. I think it's based largely on circular reasoning, but I don't accept either, the sort of traditional that Moses wrote every word of the Torah. I think it's the truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a mixture of some different things.
And the reason I ask that is because clearly, the author was familiar with Babylonian customs and religion.
Yeah.
But if you ascribe authorship to the time of the exile, you're talking 7 or 8 centuries after the events described. And I wonder how much of the religion of the Amorites who founded Babylon in the 19th century BC would have been preserved all the way down to the Chaldean Neo-Babylonian period in the...
The way that, again, we're speculating here on how this would have worked, but a lot of what's responded to is very specifically the Marduk complex, which fits with the exile because it's 6th century BC.
Right.
Now, if you were a scribe, again, here's the speculation part. If you were a scribe sitting there and you're reading a Marduk text and I hate this guy Marduk, we got to diss him somehow, or we have to set this history straight, you could have, in theory, gone to a library and looked up older versions. I mean, it assumes if you're reading Marduk material, you're reading Akkadian, which means you could read the older stuff too. So you could, if you want to use sources, you could check with this or that. In Genesis 1, Enuma Elish, again, is because of the grammar and syntax there are places in the first, chapter of Genesis, the first 3 verses, in fact, that grammatically and structurally are very, very similar to Enuma Elish. And that tells scholars that this is what the biblical writer is targeting. You wouldn't do this unless you wanted to make it clear what you were writing about. In other words, what the backstory is here. So if you're a literate scribe and you're a Jew and you have access to this material, which to some degree they must have, especially in the Persian period, it's more tolerant. But even during the Babylonian period, there's no reason to suspect that literate Jews would not have been allowed to access this material or even been trained. You take a look at Daniel. I mean, this is exactly what happens with him. So, scholars look at that and go, well, there's something going on there during this period because of these connection points.
But even by the time, and just taking this and looking at it from a different angle, even by the time of the Exodus in the 15th century BC, assuming that you ascribe to that date, and there's some debate between scholars as to whether it's 15th century or 13th century, But by that point, the Amorite king, and this is I think a point that needs to be emphasized. Old Babylon was founded by Amorites.
Mm-hmm.
So Amorite King Og of Bashan was at least a distant cousin to the Amorites who founded the kingdom of Babylon. Prior to the 19th century BC, Babylon was a really unimportant village. In fact, the first few kings of Babylon didn't even call themselves the king of Babylon. It was the king of whatever the nearby town was. It was a little more important. But by that point, by the time of the Exodus, Babylon had been around and had been a big deal for several hundred years. Hammurabi was roughly 18th century BC. And so we're talking, about 300 years before the Exodus. And they had diplomatic contact with Egypt, with most of the rest of the Near East as an educated person. Moses would probably have known a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's either going to be, I don't think it's impossible that Moses, would have, known this or that. The issue ultimately is how closely a text is being followed. And sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's not. Moses would have been capable, certainly, because if he's raised in Pharaoh's house, Akkadian was the international language of correspondence. It was not Egyptian. It was actually Akkadian. So you're going to have to know that to at least be able to read the correspondence so you know that somebody's not trying to put one over on you.
Right.
And maybe even, again, to read treaties, because they would often make treaties in both languages, or they would use Akkadian or something like that. But so you have parts of the Torah that, like Deuteronomy is structured, like Hittite treaties, and we have the whole Battle of Kadesh thing going on, composed in Egyptian and, Hittite. And you're just going to know, and again, that whether Moses knows that depends on whether he's alive or not, because that's early, late date, kind of thing going on. But even if you're a later scribe, you could intentionally do that at a later period, because you're going to have access to this kind of material, especially if it's international correspondence. But all of it ultimately is speculative. Even if, let's just say that nothing, we'll take the extreme minimalist view, that there are some scholars out there, and they are viewed by secular scholars as an extreme group, that think that the Torah is post-Persian and even Hellenistic, all of it. Very, very, very late. Well, let's just even assume that. So why would that rule out a very good oral tradition that you're going to be retelling and telling generation after generation after generation? Especially, again, if you're an elite class, people who, there were storytellers. There, in oral cultures, there were people who would memorize huge amounts of material. We know this from other cultures. There's no reason that just suppose it was different here. You're going to be memorizing it in your own language. You're going to be transmitting it in your own language. That language is a Semitic language. And so you're going to have these connection points back into East and West Semitic language. You're going to be using loan words like appear in the Bible. In other words, you can account for a lot of this stuff even orally. Now, the person transmitting it orally may not really know what they were transmitting, but they're going to be able to do the task, and then it later gets codified or edited. To me, again, that's not a stretch to think that, even though I think the minimalist view is kind of crazy. But you still have this, and a minimalist would not give oral tradition any credit. A minimalist would say they're just making it up, during the Hellenistic, or at most recent for them, the Persian period. It's a very negative view in terms of how we view Scripture, but it's out there. But you could even talk about oral tradition and say, look, you don't have to have a scribe sitting at a desk to produce this passage. They could be getting it orally and then codifying it at some point, and now it exists as a text. And now if we want to edit it, we can. If more hands, if they had a very open view of the number of hands that get to touch the text we call the canon. And we as Christians make assumptions that, 1 Samuel must have wrote that because his name's on it. Well, the book never claims that. Neither does anybody else, for that matter.
And he would have had a real habit of writing about himself in the third person.
Yeah, we think everybody's like doing journal projects like we did in middle school. It's not the way it was. So, it was wide open for God to pick people to, do things with existing text, either to update them or supplement them in some way, or to rearrange the content so that there was there's something telegraphed by the arrangement. God is perfectly capable, so the Jews thought of picking people in the back of the room and saying, hey, it's your turn now. Let's get with the program here and do something with this because we need to preserve this for posterity. And so none of what I'm suggesting here would have been foreign to a Jewish mindset.
Yeah, my Welsh ancestors preserved the genealogy of my family line. I've got an ancestor came over in the 17th century named Richard Owings, and through him I can trace my family line all the way back to Old King Cole, literally 4th century Romanized Britain named
that's crazy.
Coyle Hayne. Yeah.
That is crazy.
Yeah, well, it looked pretty good when my daughter did it for a 4th grade project. You're going in saying, I'm descended from Old King Cole. And what?
Really?
So, yeah, it was pretty cool.
Yeah, really.
Well, speaking of genealogy, what does the genealogy of Jesus have to do with the sin of the Watchers?
Yeah, this is a chapter in the book, and it's based on the work of a recent dissertation done at Marquette by a person named Amy Richter. And it starts out, again, with raising a common question. Hey, why are there 4 women in the genealogies? Because, that it's a bit unusual. It's not unheard of. You have genealogies and chronicles, that have women in them. So it's not unheard of, but at least 2 of these women, and some would argue all 4, but at least 2 of them are Gentile, for sure. And so scholars have wondered a long time why these women. And what's the point? What's being telegraphed here? If anybody's ever, perished the thought, studied the genealogies, the genealogy of Jesus actually has some really interesting things in it. One of them does not trace his line through Solomon, for instance, and there's a reason for that. You have the women in it. You've got 4 or 3 sections of 14 names, and there's a gematria for that represents David, David, in Hebrew gematria. So it's telegraphing the son of David. There's all sorts of stuff like that.
Yeah, and of course it's the number 42, which is life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah, so there's just things going on in there. So they're worth studying, but this question has sort of persisted. Now, what Richter is arguing, and I take up this view in the book, because I think there's something to it. At the very least, it tells you what a Jew in the 1st century could very possibly have been thinking when reading about Jesus' genealogy. Again, the way a number of Jews, potentially could have or would have processed this, and that is, she argues that these 4 women, all in their story, have either commit a sexual transgression or they have some sexual transgression in their lives, done to them, and that those events are described with vocabulary that link directly into the story of the Watchers as Enoch tells it, either in Greek or Aramaic here, or goes back to Old Testament, again, certain Hebrew terms. So she's saying the way that if you read these women's stories in the original languages, there's going to be vocabulary here that is going to draw your attention back to the story of the Watcher's transgression. And you say, well, if that's true, then what would the point be? And Richter's argument is that, well, the point is that because the Second Temple Judaism had such an overwhelmingly negative view of the transgression of the Watchers, they expected their Messiah to be the one who would reverse this. And by including these women in the genealogy, the theological message was simple but profound. These women who were affected because of something they did or something that happened to them, they were ultimately affected by the kind of corruption that the Watchers, seduced humanity into. They are actually part of the process, part of the providential hand that is going to produce the Messiah who will undo the effect of the Watchers, who will defeat human corruption. And so it's a story about reversal. It's a story. It's like Genesis 50. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. That whole thing that these women play a central role, and all of the bad stuff associated with them will be made right by virtue of this person whose line they are helping to produce. And so I think she really presents a really good case. Obviously, there's a lot of detail to it. that we get into in the book, and Richter's dissertation is something that people can access if they care to.
In fact, I downloaded it while you were talking, while we were recording a program for Skywatch TV.
Yeah, it's I mean it's a dissertation, so it's a dense read, but it's actually very interesting. I think she presents a really good case to saying this is the reason why they're there, to telegraph this theological message.
Now I've got three of the women. I think Ruth, Rahab, and Tamar. Fourth woman is.
We have Ruth, we have Rahab, we have Tamar, and Bathsheba.
Bathsheba, okay,
also known as Bathshua, which again, there's something about that name that is another, has a connection into all this. But hey, you're going to have to read the book. We're not going to do it all here.
Well, and I would argue too that the story of say Tamar. Where Judah, the progenitor of the tribe that produced the Messiah, he had sex with his daughter-in-law, but it's okay. It only happened because he thought she was a temple prostitute, a cult prostitute.
Look at the big backstory there. Here you have the Kedeshah, the temple prostitution thing going on, which of course once you look at that, then all these other ideas accrue themselves to it.
Right.
But look at what's produced out of it.
Yeah,
it's the Messiah who's going to deal with you. There's a lot of this kind of thing happening in Scripture. Again, the reversal theme is a big deal. And so what I'm trying to do in this particular book is isolate the redemptive, if maybe a word like redemptive, would be more familiar, but just the redemptive, the reversal role of the Messiah, trying to sort of funnel that to, hey, the story of the Watchers was a big part of this, and New Testament writers were familiar with that. And so that influenced the way they talked about these things. And if you knew the Enochian material, you'd pick up on this stuff.
Now, again, people are probably familiar, at least, with the Genesis 6 paradigm and that story. There's an aspect of it that you've mentioned a couple of times, and I'd like to develop a little further because it's probably not as familiar to folks, and that is the work of Amar Anus in showing how the Watchers were not a creation of the Hebrews or the Jewish scribes and scholars, that the Mesopotamians knew of the Watchers. Who were the Watchers to the Mesopotamians, and what were they like?
Yeah. The Mesopotamian material really focuses on the story of the Apkallu, and again, Anus is the guy who does the the yeoman's work here to marshal all the primary textual data on this. But if you know the Apkallu story, that would provide the answer to a question like, why in the world is Genesis 6:1 through 4 even in the Bible? Because it just looks kind of weird. They include this before the flood, and there's what's the point? Again, if you know the backstory, you'll know right away what the point is. The Apkallu, again, were viewed before the flood. They are divine beings, and they are considered culture heroes by Mesopotamians because they gave humanity knowledge that led to human civilization. So they were good guys in their story. And eventually, the higher up authorities, Mesopotamian gods, get tired of their creation, human beings, because they're noisy and they're just kind of a nuisance. And so they decide, well, we're going to wipe them out with a flood. Well, the Apkallu, the problem here is, well, all this work we put into humanity, to help, civilize them, and that was a good thing. That's all going to be done away with. Then they're just going to go back to being slaves if there's any of them left, and all this kind of stuff. So we're not told until after the flood, sort of how this works out. But after the flood, the kings that are listed in certain Mesopotamian texts post-flood are credited with ruling, a particular Apkallu helping them to be a good king, helping them to rule and restore civilization. But the curious thing is the Apkallu after the flood are not 100% divine. They are divine and human. They are, for lack of a better term, hybrids. And there are texts that actually, just describe this, that, apparently the Apkallu, to preserve their knowledge, the plan they came up with was to mate with human women, and the product of that were these hybrid beings, also called Apkallu, because they had divine knowledge now. And they're also described as being giants. You have Gilgamesh, who's called Lord of the Apkallu on a cylinder seal, for instance, and is associated with the Apkallu in other ways. He is, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. I mean, he's the hybrid. He's a giant. He's described in in terms of cubits in giant terms. And so you have all of the elements, even the, getting the, in the Enoch case, the fallen watchers into the abyss, into Tartarus, the bad place in hell, as if hell needs another bad place.
Hell squared,
right? Squared, on steroids or something. Even getting them there, the Babylonian version of this is that Marduk, who is the chief deity this particular text, gets angry and he consigns the Apkallu to the abyss to never return again, and as a judgment. So there you go. That's where they are. So every element of the Watcher story, as Enoch tells it, is found in Mesopotamian material. And here's why it's important. You say, well, who cares? What does that have to do with Genesis 6:1-4? What it does is it provides, again, the rationale for why Genesis 6:1-4 even exists, because the biblical, those 4 verses is the biblical corrective to this Mesopotamian story. These are not good guys. This is not a good thing. This is a transgression of heaven and earth. And out of this is going to come the primary enemies of Israel that are trying to exterminate Israel and get rid of the people of God, and all these bad things. So the biblical writers need to correct the perception, but also it's important because since Enoch preserves all of those Mesopotamian connections, okay, that's the only place that's going to be tracking on that. And so when things in Peter and Jude show up, like the angels that sinned, that are in chains, in gloomy darkness, in Tartarus, okay, which is a word drawn from the Greek material about the Titans, who are the classical Greek equivalent of the Watchers, the sons of God, the giants, and all this stuff. When this stuff starts showing up in Peter and Jude, and it isn't in the Old Testament, these details about the offending angels getting sent to the abyss and all that, it tells you that Enoch has real value because the biblical writers, by reading that stuff and endorsing those points of contact and points of content in Enoch, actually help us to understand our Old Testament better. Mm-hmm. So it's very evident that this material comes from the book that we call Enoch, First Enoch. And First Enoch, it should be held in high esteem for this point, at least in this material, because it actually preserves the original context for an Old Testament passage that is really weird, that is really cryptic. Mm-hmm. And you find the solution to this, just as Anos did, by looking at Enoch and then looking at Mesopotamian material. And, like, where did the writer of Enoch get this stuff? And, oh, here we go. Mm-hmm. It comes from these sources. And so it ties all these loose ends together. Yeah.
The thing that's fascinated me in the research that I've been doing over the last year, and I don't know if I'd call it research accurately, I've been reading what actual scholars have been researching.
Still research. It's what you do if you were in a doctoral program.
I'll take credit for that then. Is finding how many details like that reinforce what
it's kind of astonishing all that's out there.
It really is. It really is. And I begin to get just a little bit of a sense of where you've been all these years. You've kind of blazed a trail here, and the significance of Hermon. Mm-hmm. And I stumbled onto this paper, and I know that you're aware of this paper, the Abode of El, Edward Lipinski, who wrote this paper back in like 1979 or something like that. But he points out that in the old Babylonian copy of the Gilgamesh epic, Gilgamesh and Enkidu travel to Mount Hermon, and Hermon and Lebanon, in those words, are described as the secret abode of the Anunnaki. Mm-hmm. Now, given that was the old Babylonian period, so we're talking 18th, 19th century BC, knowing that the Amorites who founded Babylon were building on Sumerian traditions and adopting Sumerian cosmology with the added twist of elevating Marduk from a nothing to the head of the pantheon.
Subsuming all the other deities.
Exactly. They may have been building on a Sumerian tradition of Hermon being a sacred space, a sacred place, and placing this emphasis on Mount Hermon, which they would have been familiar with. Mm-hmm. Certainly the Babylonians would have been familiar with it, because if their original homeland, as most scholars believe, was somewhere in central Syria, and boy, isn't it weird that the homeland of the Amorites, the original homeland, happens to be the core of the territory controlled by the Islamic State today. That's probably coincidence. I'm not going to make a theological point there. It's just weird. But I think that idea may have traveled west to east instead of east to west. I mean, traveled to Babylon as the Amorites moved down into the Fertile Crescent, into Sumer, and brought that idea of Mount Hermon being this abode of the gods with them.
Yeah, in one respect, it's kind of logical, because if you are either from this region, again, as an Amorite, and then again, you move into Babylon, if you're in this region, or even if you were from Babylon and you visited this region, the one thing you're going to notice right away is Hermon. Okay.
It's huge. It's twice as tall as any other mountain.
Exactly.
I mean, the next tallest mountain in the entire ancient Near East is Baal's holy mountain, Mount Zaphon.
Yep. So you look at that and you think the very understandable thought to yourself, that has got to be where the gods live. Mm-hmm. It's a very normal kind of thing for an ancient person to think, because it's so, it's so remote, it's so spectacularly beyond anything you've seen, that in that mindset, that would have just been like a no-brainer. Well, if the gods live anywhere, they're going to live there. It'd just be like you going into, some town and you see the most amazing, house in town. Well, surely, you're going to put somebody, well, maybe the mayor lives there. Maybe, some person who's, maybe a famous person, that surely they've got to live in that. You make these assumptions based upon what the visual is. So it's really understandable that that could have been part of the tradition brought in by either the native population, or even adopted maybe for some reason, that somebody from Babylon could have gone west and then back home again, or something like that. I'm not really surprised by that, just because of the spectacle that Hermon is in that area.
So then you've got a double sort of an added layer of meaning when Jesus goes up Mount Hermon and
at the foot of
Transfiguration.
Mount Hermon, the Transfiguration, yeah.
And of course, Peter's declaration at the foot of Mount Hermon, right?
Yeah. And I talked a lot about that in Unseen Realm, and there's a little bit of that in this book as well. The whole concept of Jesus and spiritual warfare. At the foot of Mount Hermon, you have this is where the gates of hell are. This place where Jesus and the disciples are doesn't just have a Greco-Roman history; it has a deep Old Testament history that takes you into this material with the Rephaim, and of course, when you get to the Rephaim, you get the Amorites, because they're called kings of the Amorites. The connections are transparently there. Mm-hmm. The whole gates of hell. Ugaritic texts have this area as one of the places that is the gateway to the netherworld. The cult to Baal right there. I mean, you got to be a dunderhead to miss these things. If you're in the ancient world, like, you would have been looked at like, boy, you're dumb. Like, can't you figure this out? To us, it's a lot harder, because we're not living them. But this is the place where we have Peter's confession. Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not be able to withstand it. Mm-hmm. And it takes on a whole different flavor if you think the gates of hell that's where they're standing, and boy, does that place have a history. Mm-hmm. And this is where Baal, the Lord of the Dead, is worshipped. Well, we're going to turn Baal and Baal's nice little domicile into his tomb. Mm-hmm. That's why we're here. And then a few days later, the Gospels have Jesus going up under the mountain. Well, there's only one mountain there. Yeah, and it's Hermon, and that's where the Transfiguration occurs. So why does Jesus pick that place to basically reveal his glory? And, again, my reading of that is he's picking a fight. Mm-hmm. This is who I am. I'm here. I'm do something about it. Mm-hmm. And, that right after that, he turns and he tells his disciples, well, I hope you all had fun here. It's fun to go down and pick on Satan. It's fun to go down, and pick on the gates of hell. And now we're here on Mount Hermon, and, we get to poke the watchers in the eye and all that stuff. But, from this point forward, he began to teach them that the Son of Man must go to Jerusalem and die. Mm-hmm. And they're like, what? This is crazy talk.
We just,
right. Yeah. We just, you're up here, swatting the flies, like, Lord of the Flies guy.
Yeah.
We're up here and this is awesome, and now you start talking about dying. And he's picking a fight.
Mm-hmm.
He has to die. You can't have a resurrection without a death. And of course, he knows that. He knows what the plan is, that the plan is, it was secret. It was a mystery.
1 Corinthians 2:6-8.
Yeah, I take Paul seriously. Had the rulers of this world known, what the fallout would have been of the crucifixion, they never would have been dumb enough
to put him on the cross.
To put him on the cross. So they don't know, and it's a big deal.
Yeah, I'm in my book. I get into some prophetic speculation on how bad interpretation or assuming that we know too much about prophecy is going to lead to some bloodshed, because our Jewish brothers and sisters, those who expect a literal messianic, the literal arrival of the Messiah, are looking for a geopolitical savior, just as they were in the first century.
Yeah. And
sadly, when they got the guy they thought was going to be their savior, Simon Bar Kokhba, in the early second century, they wound up with Judea depopulated, name changed, Jerusalem destroyed, Judea in ruins. And that's the guy that they're looking for. In fact, I even read one rabbi's website where he said, well, we know Jesus of Nazareth wasn't the Messiah because he didn't look anything like Simon Bar Kokhba.
Yeah.
And from the Christians who refused to fight for Simon Bar Kokhba.
Right. How did that turn out?
Yeah. It's Dr. Phil, how'd that work out for you? Sadly, that's the guy they're going to look for again, I fear. And there are a lot of Christians who don't understand prophecy or will pick and choose elements of it where, and I credit you for this, because you pointed this out, and I was like, oh yeah, that make all kind of sense, because God isn't called the Lord of armies, the Lord of hosts, for nothing. He's not a stupid general. He's not going to spell out his entire battle plan for the enemy to to counter, before the event. He's given us enough clues to understand where, to know when he returns. Oh yeah, in the clouds at the head of a heavenly army. If somebody else claims that he's the Messiah and his
need to know basis.
Exactly. So we need to just step back and quit, assuming that we know more than we actually do. Because I do think there's some danger to that. And
I'm glad to hear you say it, because I know my view is that prophecy is deliberately cryptic. It was deliberately cryptic the first time around, and we have no reason to suspect that it's going to be any different the next time around.
Right.
And that irritates, some Christians, because they want, tell us what to believe, I can't, tell you with any degree of certainty this, that, or the other thing about prophecy, because, we're just not supposed to know. That's why you can erect 4, 5, 6 different systems, and they all look wonderful, of course, until you look at the outliers to all the systems, and then those become quote unquote problem passages that we come up with, great explanations for to make the system work. Well, that it's artificial. On one hand, it's not. I'm not saying that's a sin. To pick a system, go pick the one you like, but realize that these ambiguities are built in. They are built in to what we call biblical prophecy, and that's by design.
Yeah, and that's been a relatively recent change in my view over the last couple of years. At the prophecy conference in Colorado last July, I made a point of bringing that up during my presentation on this material. So here's a way that I think it may play out, but understand that none of us has it figured out, and that's by design.
Well, I'm glad you see you can get away with that, Derek. I can't. I can't even get invited to the thing. So if I got invited and did something like that, it'd be the kiss of death. But you can. You have the street cred to do that. So
on the other hand, I don't have a PhD to defend either, so I can venture a little further from the text. One of the things I really found interesting is the whole concept of Babel, and why God found that so significant that he had to step in and stop it. And again, I get into some speculation in my book. I think David Rohl makes a fairly good case for the ziggurat at Eridu and the Temple of Enki being the actual Tower of Babel for a number of reasons. The extant poem, Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata, deals...
I'm with you. He could certainly be correct there.
Yeah, and the fact that that reconstruction project was to build the Temple of Enki, the Lord of the Abyss, into the abode of the gods, according to that poem. There was something more to it than just hubris.
Sometimes they mean what they say.
Yeah, very possibly. There was more to it than just hubris.
Yeah.
What is your take on that situation? What about that building project could have been so provocative that Yahweh had to personally step in and say, no, this is not going to be completed?
Well, I mean, if you're, again, Babel, of course, is post Genesis 6. Isn't that a wonderful observation? Mm-hmm. I mean, but again, because of the context for that, if you don't step in, if you let the people, humanity that you've created and you've commanded, and that really has regrown the population since the flood, if you don't insist that they do what you want them to do, or if you let them do the opposite, then, look at what you got. Mm-hmm. You have essentially you have an adulteration of the identity of who the true God is. You have, in effect, you eviscerate the polemic against what the Apkallu did. You have you swap in Babel or Babylon for Eden. This is the new Eden. I mean, there's all sorts of theological ramifications to this. That, again, if you're thinking big picture, which God does think mm-hmm. big picture, then it sort of begs for a response. It's not just that, I don't want you talking the same language, so enough of that, mm-hmm. enough of that silliness, or God just sort of having a temper tantrum.
Yeah.
There's just a lot going on here that needs to be done in response, both in terms of the actual events and also theological messaging too, mm-hmm. for future generations.
Yeah. Again, it's if it were a simple matter of pride, mm-hmm. God would be down here on a weekly basis to right. smite somebody or other. Yeah. Ricky Henderson back in the day. Today I'm the greatest of all time. Well, there's a lot here, and I know we only scratched the surface, but the whole point is to whet the appetites of listeners. And again, I would suspect that people listening to this podcast are already pre-selected to be predisposed to, after 9 years, if you can't figure out what I talk about and what I like to, find interesting. 7 years, I guess. Started this.
Well, I mean, what we're trying to do here is we want people to, it's got to be about the text. Okay, what can the text sustain? If you're here to perpetuate a denomination, your own little Christian subculture, and you're not thinking in terms of, really why you're alive, to serve the Lord and to further the kingdom of God and leave, again, the ultimate outcome to these things to Him, but essentially, do your job, be faithful, transmit the truth. Be guided by the text of Scripture, and enjoy it. Enjoy all that. Those things aren't drudgeries. We want you to experience the thrill of discovery in books like this, and also sort of just to reorient your thinking to why am I really here? I mean, what should drive me when I wake up in the morning? Is it to stay in XYZ denomination and make sure I got every I dotted and T crossed? Or is it to learn Scripture, to try to master Scripture, to understand it, to have it affect my life, and to transmit that to others? I mean, why are you even here? These are big picture things, and I know I write books for that reason. I want people to experience the thrill of really grasping the Word of God, and we try to kick that can down the road with everything we produce, and that's really what drives me. That's what I want to know. That's what I want to do, and I just want to have other people sort of glom onto that and experience it too.
Well, I'll tell you, reading the Bible with the divine counsel concept in view has
it changes everything.
Yeah, it's made it really exciting, especially when you stumble on the passages that you didn't know were there. Like, there was one that was in Isaiah where you read that the Israelites were leaving out ritual meals for fortune and destiny, mm-hmm. and the ESV translators picked up on something and they capitalized fortune and destiny. It's like, wait a minute, let's dig into this a little bit more. Oh, those are deities. One named and I forget one, but the other is Gad, fortune. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh, okay, it kind of puts an interesting spin on the name of the son born to Jacob, the progenitor of that tribe. And there are a lot of nuggets like that in the Bible, where you find out that there are words translated as nouns that are also names of deities that have been kind of almost scrubbed from the Bible.
I mean, it is totally my favorite description of what my book, Unseen Realm, and websites and podcasts that I do, what it does for people is one woman said, once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Right.
And that is really true. And again, I'm not sitting here telling everybody that I've come up with a theory of everything for the Bible. But I will say this, that if you can think like an Israelite and think like a first century Jew, and these are major, centerpieces of that worldview, divine counsel worldview, Deuteronomy 32 worldview. If you can do that, you may not have a theory of everything, but the splintered mess, the splintered mass of pieces that your Bible is to you will come together in ways that you can just hardly believe half the time. How much sense it actually makes if you can, again, filter it not through our own traditions, but try to recapture what was in their heads. And that's the task. At least that's how I perceive why I'm here, to try to get into that myself and then try to transmit it. And I think your book as well is going to really help people, connect lots of dots like that, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to get them to think like an ancient person. And lo and behold, isn't that profound?
Yeah. Well,
why would we want to read the Bible like an ancient person?
Well, the more gray we get in our beards, Mike, I think the easier we'll find it to convince people, yes, I am an ancient person, so you should listen to me.